Hey there, YouTube. I'm Yukitsu. This is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to a little bit of a Tuesday talk show. So today we're going to be talking a lot about the tarot cards, and we're going to be relating it a little bit to Jungian psychology where we can, and we're also going to be talking very much about Persona 5 and also Persona 3 and 4 in this particular one. We're not going to be spoiling it. I'll put a spoiler warning when we do start that, but you've got a little while before we start going into there. So the Persona series leans heavily on the tarot cards and the major arcana as a sort of storytelling device and sort of an idea that they're sort of the archetypes that dominate the sort of Jungian psyche. Now, Carl Jung actually used different archetypes, but he was a lot looser in what could be an archetype and what they sort of meant and so on and so forth. So they've essentially replaced the Jungian archetypes with the tarot card deck, which I think actually works quite well as an analog. We have to remember that Carl Jung himself believed heavily in the sort of ideas of mysticism, or at the very least he studied it very intensely, believing that the ideas in mysticism were a gateway into the ideas that were held in the collective unconscious that all humans shared. So when we say that the tarot cards could easily be used as the archetypes, since they are themselves archetypal figures, it's not that difficult to then sort of transplant them into the collective unconscious as being those archetypes. There's nothing in particular too incoherent about that. Now, Carl Jung himself had sort of his own idea about what the archetypes were, the shadow being one of them, for example, the anima and the animus, and those don't really appear in the tarot deck, of course, but the sort of idea of replacing them with a more concrete foundation sort of, I think, aids in the series' ability to sort of progress as a whole, and I think it was ultimately a fairly good decision, and I think that's also one that Carl Jung drew heavy inspiration from. The process of individuation is one wherein we take away the persona and then start delving into the psyche of the individual, the unconscious and the collective unconscious, going through the different archetypes in a sort of process that is an awful lot like a journey. And similarly, the tarot deck includes something called the Fool's Journey. This is where we no longer are using the tarot cards for sort of symbolic meaning necessarily, but instead using them to tell a story that goes from 0 to, generally speaking, 20 or 21, depending on what your deck is. Some decks get rid of some arcana and some include other arcana. So generally speaking, I'm going to say 21 because that's what I believe the Persona series generally uses. It doesn't always use that. Sometimes it discludes judgment and also discludes the world, but those are included in these games, so we'll include them here. But in any event, both of these processes are one where you sort of analyze your life through these archetypal figures, or go through each of these archetypal figures in a journey through your life, as it were, and by that process you come to a state of sort of enlightenment is the best way to put it, both the process of individuation and the Fool's Journey. So I think that it works well to say that this is a sort of a replacement for the process of individuation, the Fool's Journey, and I think that it works quite well for the series as a whole, so I'm glad that they decided to do that instead of taking Jung necessarily verbatim. And I think at the same time, if you talk to Carl Jung about this, I would imagine that he would say that the Fool's Journey is a form of passing through the archetypes to individuation. The main difference is that I don't think that Carl Jung believed that we were born as a sort of tabula rasa, which is what the tarot card sort of implies with the Fool's Journey, because you start off with infinite possibilities. I think that Carl Jung believed that people started off with traits that were drawn up from the collective unconscious, but I think that that's one of those sort of weird things where mysticism and psychology don't really necessarily provide easy answers as to anything concrete, because obviously mysticism is all nonsense, but it's fun nonsense. This is why I sort of know about tarot cards to a certain degree, and about the arcana and about astrology and all that other stuff. I don't necessarily believe in it, but it's still a hell of a lot of fun to actually go into and understand. So in any event, knowing what I've just said about the various different arcana and the Fool's Journey, meaning that the Fool is obviously always important, being the main character and the main protagonist, but each of the games also has at least one other major arcana. That's the wrong word to use, major arcana. That's a bit confusing. There's a predominant arcana to each of the games that sort of underlies the entire experience. It's most obvious and self-evident in 3. In 3, it's the Death Arcana, and they basically just spew the word out at you whenever they get the chance. And this is used in both the sort of symbolic form, when you sort of just flip the card up, what does it mean on a very blank reading, as well as what it means during the Fool's Journey. The Fool's Journey sort of implies that death means that you're sort of coming to a crossroads in your life, and you're sort of removing all of the unwanted elements of your past and of your life, and sort of discarding them, tying them off, concluding them, finishing what needs to be finished, and then moving past them. Now that you've finished with it, you're done with it, you can move past, you can move on. Obviously, the Death Arcana in the Fool's Journey is not the last card in the deck. I think it's like 3/4 of the way through or something like that. So it actually represents something that is not literal death, because then you wouldn't be able to continue the rest of your journey, obviously. But in Persona 3, it just is the most dominating arcana in the entire series there, and is almost always evident in some degree or another in the arcana when you discuss the social links with all the various different people there. By contrast, Persona 4 would be the Justice Arcana, in my opinion. This is a little bit less clear, but is still fairly clear. Like, the only difference is that they're not constantly yabbering at you death, 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 like they were in Persona 3. The difference is that justice does actually mean truth when you look at sort of what it indicates. It means sort of justice, truth, law, and what is right. And that's sort of the indication of what the Justice Arcana means. During the Fool's Journey, however, it means something quite different. This one's not one of the ones that sort of relates back and forth too easily. During the sort of Fool's Journey, what the Justice Arcana represents is when you sort of need to reflect back on everything that you've done up to that point in your life, and you need to sort of take responsibility for it and use that as a learning mechanism to sort of uncover what you are going to do to determine a course for the future. You use the past to inform yourself. It's like, what did I do that was right? What did I do that was wrong? What do I have to apologize for? What do I have to keep with me? What do I have to keep doing? What is the right path? That's sort of what the Justice Arcana indicates, based around the sort of based on the Fool's Journey there. And this is, again, something that you'll very often see in the various different social links in Persona 4. Even if it's, of course, not the Justice Arcana, these people are people that are talking about events in their past that have informed their sort of life up to that point, and what that means to them, and how they're going to use that to do something in the future. And that's sort of the Justice Arcana at work there. In Persona 5, it's actually very not obvious what the dominating arcana is. And I'm going to tell you, actually, if I feel like I got it right later. But just from the social links that I've completed so far, the Confidant ranks that I've finished, or max ranked at this point in time, I'm going to say that the dominating arcana for Persona 5 is the Hanged Man. And I think that it aesthetically fits the series, just because, of course, the idea of a criminal being hanged works well for the Phantom Thieves as a whole there. But what the Hanged Man actually means is a sense of... hold on. In the Fool's Journey, I can't remember what it means when you just pull the card out of the deck off the top of my head, but I believe it means sort of serenity. But what it means in sort of the Fool's Journey is that you've encountered something that is completely insurmountable, that is holding you down, holding you back, and you cannot get past it. And the only way that you can get past it is by giving up. And that's sort of what the Hanged Man represents in Persona, or in the Arcana. The only sort of problem that I have with my interpretation that it's the dominating arcana in Persona 5 is that the person that represents the Hanged Man isn't really that important to the story of it. I mean, it is one of the only people that you're pretty much guaranteed to have to talk to, but at the same time, I don't think that it's really that vital a character. So that could be something slightly different, but I don't think that it's the Magician Arcana, which is by far the most dominating in terms of where they are with you. But I don't think it was meant to necessarily be as obvious, but I'm going to have hazard. I'll tell you if I think that I got it right a little bit later on. But I'm getting that vibe from every single Arcana that I encounter. The reason that it also works well is that Persona 5 is all about sort of shackles that people place on you, and sort of tie you down and pull you down and stop you from getting anywhere. And this isn't really something that is meant to be easily surmountable. The society that we live in and the people around us and sort of elements that are trying to drag us down, it's not something that we're supposed to be able to easily overcome. But at the same time, I don't necessarily know that we can get through it just by giving up, as the Arcana would sort of imply. But it's the idea that trying to control everything causes you to lose control to a certain degree. It's a very interpretable card in the journey. So we do encounter actually a lot of characters who tried to control everything. And that sort of struggle for control ends up jeopardizing everything they believe in, and sort of causes them to become sort of who they are, I suppose. But it also causes other people to sort of be shackled down in a way that they cannot surpass. We could talk a little bit about Takemi, which is with the first social link that I maxed out in Persona 5. She encounters this part in her social link where she cannot continue on doing the thing that she needed to do. It becomes impossible for her to achieve her goal. But what she does is that she stops trying to fight it. And you as the protagonist end up doing is taking on that burden and fighting against it for her. And in doing so, in letting someone else deal with the problem, essentially, it becomes something that she can get around. In her case, it was an individual trying to sabotage her sort of medical career, lying about someone having died who she was trying to cure. And by sort of changing that person's heart, you're able to then help her keep her career, and she becomes able to cure the person who is terminally ill, who she had thought had died. And obviously, since the medical guy that was trying to get her to quit was lying about that, obviously she was able to then move forward and continue on with her job there. But this is something that was not possible for her to deal with, and as long as she kept trying to deal with it herself, she would fail. And it's by giving control of that to someone else, essentially, which isn't quite what the Hangman is all about, which is why I think that it doesn't necessarily work. But we're going to be talking about a couple different arcanas and sort of how they work in the different games, and sort of talk about what I relate back to how I was talking about all this. In Persona 3, we're going to talk about the Sun Arcana and compare it in 3, 4, and 5, and talk a little bit about why I think 4's works best, just from my personal view and from a psychological point of view. But in Persona 3, we can talk about the Sun Arcana. This is an individual who is dying of a terminal unnamed illness. It's some sort of genetic thing, so who knows? He's too young for it to be. I can't remember the name of that disorder, actually, that kills people invariably in their 40s when they have it. It's been a while since I've actually had to know the name of that. But in any event, he essentially is going to die within like a year, essentially. And this has made it so that it's been very difficult for him to sort of continue pursuing his sort of passions. And the Sun Arcana is about finding tremendous joy in sort of the important things in your life, whether it be, it's usually related to creativity or imagination or something like that, but it doesn't have to be. It's essentially in finding your one true means of contentment, is how I would put it. And in his particular case, what he has to do is sort of leave behind his regrets about dying, and like we encounter in this particular arcana very literal death, which is not necessarily typical of the Death Arcana. Most of the characters who are in that arcana in Persona 3 are not literally going to die during the process of the game. Some of them do, but not all of them. But in any event, this individual is trying to write a book, but he's been having difficulty coming to grips with whether or not it's worth doing, simply because he won't be alive for very much longer. But you help him sort of overcome that sort of fear of death, or that sort of complacency around death, and instead he sort of finishes the book that he had wanted before he goes away. And that's essentially the entirety of that. He sort of finds joy in the process of writing for its own sake, and decides that he's going to finish because he wants to finish, because that's what he truly intends to do. And the only way he can do that is by getting sort of past that sort of idea of dying, coming to terms with it. In Persona 4, we encounter, I'm going to talk about Yumi because that's the social link that I went for. There's 2 different Sun Arcanas in Persona 4. I'm going to assume that they both have similar elements, but again, we're going to look at it through the lens of the Sun Arcana being both the Sun Arcana but informed by the Justice Arcana. In Persona 4, you're talking to an individual who is excellent at drama and acting, is a very good actor and so on and so forth, but has a very disturbed family life, has difficulty coming to terms with that. And what you sort of encounter throughout the process of it is the realization she comes to in the very end is that drama was just a means for her to escape from her family life. And what she ends up deciding is that what truly brings her joy is being with her family, or more importantly, being with her mother, not her father, and that she doesn't really need acting. So she does this through a process of self-reflection and of revealing parts of her backstory to the main character by discussing her family life and of what it was that was going on with her past. And this, again, is sort of relating to what I was talking about with the Justice Arcana, looking at what sort of actions and decisions brought you to that point and what you regret about those actions and so on and so forth and what you'll do in the future. Because her storyline is that while she's excellent at acting and so on and so forth, it's mostly to escape from her family life. But at a certain point in the story, her father ends up in the hospital with a terminal condition. And in Persona 3, this is where someone dies. But 4, this is where someone dies. But in any event, she makes the sort of decision that she's going to quit drama and focus instead on her family. That's sort of her decision there. And it's because she sort of has that catalyst of her father sort of dying there that she sort of realizes that, she doesn't want to neglect her family like he did. And it's something that she realizes upon reflection that she had been doing to a certain extent. In Persona 5, we get Tora something. Everyone calls him No Good Tora, but I can't remember his real name. In any event, he's a politician who is sort of hounded again by his past there, and he cannot get elected, essentially. Now, what I like about his arcana is that you don't actually have to go into mementos to get him to rank 10. You're able to sort of get him to rank 10 just by talking the problem through and discussing things and keeping him on the right path there. But he sort of fits into the same role of he's trying to become a politician, and he's able to get elected at the very end of his campaign there to a certain degree. I don't remember what he gets elected to or what he was trying to get elected as, but I think it's a member of the Diets or something like that. I don't understand Japanese politics at all. But in any event, he is a little bit different from some of the others in the sense that he's able to push past his own problems to a certain degree, and is able to sort of get to where he wants to go without necessarily too much outside help. But he did need you as a sort of moral guide point, as a sort of stand-in, because he has these sort of very crippling moments where people are antagonizing him and he can't sort of get past his past, for lack of a better word. And so he sort of continues to falter as a politician, unable to sort of keep his way forward or be confident in himself or what he's doing. But he's essentially truly passionate in what he's doing, and he's truly passionate in trying to change Japan for the better and so on and so forth. Hard to say if he's just, all talk, but we'll have to, I guess, see. It's implied that he's not. It's implied that he's actually trying to help people as best as he possibly can. But gets drowned out by other people and by his own past reputation, which he's incapable of getting past on his own. In fact, it's only in the final speech when he sort of embraces his past there. He admits to his past. He describes everyone around there. Yeah, this is what I was. This is what I did, and it's nothing that I can really, make up for. Like one of his speeches is him admitting to a lot of his past faults there and describing a lot of the problems that he's had in the past there and how it's made him grow stronger there. But to a certain degree there, he simply just says, yeah, those are the problems that I have. Those are the reasons that I can't move forward. I admit all those. I can't do anything about those. And, he's not trying to control those problems anymore. He's not trying to do anything about them. He's one of the weaker examples of the Hanged Man in the Arcana. But I think he still does represent a little bit of it. To a certain degree, he also you could also have transplanted much of his story into something like the Justice Arcana, but they don't actually focus on his past all that much when you're talking to him. They're mostly focusing on his current inability to deal with his reputation and how everyone talks about him like that. Like, he doesn't reflect on his past all that much, really, but he does, in the end, sort of accept it. So I think out of all of them, he's the one that could fit into Persona 4, which is why I think that he stood out a little bit to me. The other one that we're going to be talking about, and this is where we segue into major spoiler territory, is going to be the Justice Arcana. And this is going to be major spoilers for Persona 4 and 5, not really for 3, but we'll be talking about those as well. And this is where I put the spoiler alert. This is where, if you're going to listen to the rest of the video, I'm going to talk about this Arcana, and then I'm going to talk about Persona 5 and what I've been seeing in the parts that I've played through. The reason that we're talking about this, of course, is because I finally started maxing out social links in Persona 5, so, that's a thing. But in any event, we got the Justice Arcana in Persona 3. This is the sort of timid student council treasury secretary, Chihiro, who was one of my favorite characters actually in Persona 3. It's nice that she had a cameo in Persona 4 as well, but her storyline is essentially that she feels like she's very shy and timid and intimidated by other people. She gets accused of things that she didn't do. And what she decides is that she needs to change as a person. She needs to drop that sort of mousiness and so on and so forth, and become more assertive and more confident and so on and so forth. It's one of the weaker links to the Arcana, in my opinion, but that's ultimately what she's decided to do. You've got sort of the idea of leaving behind her past self, which is very much in line with death, but there's not a ton necessarily that relates to justice in the Fool's Journey sense. What it relates to in terms of justice, because she's falsely accused of something, is that it is primarily about sort of justice in the sense of justice and what is right and what is truth and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really fit the Fool's Journey quite as well, but it still fits the Arcana in a certain sense there. But ultimately, it's more about a journey of self-discovery for that character through the Death Arcana. So I think that it was an interesting sort of character, but not necessarily the best example of it. In Persona 4, it's personified by Nanako, which is one of the key characters of that game. I would argue is sort of like the moral center for the main character in a certain sense there, and becomes one of the major catalysts for the end of the game and its storyline there, when, spoiler alert, she ends up in the TV world. So Nanako's storyline is justice layered on justice in a certain sense there. And what it is her trying to come to grips with her current situation there. She's trying to figure out what exactly her place is in sort of the household and in the world and so on and so forth, because she's sort of been left alone because her mother had been killed and so on and so forth, and she has really very few people that she can turn to. Oops, hold on a sec, my computer has done something very, very strange here. 1 second. Alright, sorry about that. My computer is literally frozen up on the screensaver for some reason. In any event, so the Justice Arcana is through Nanako in Persona 4, and it's a fairly simplistic one despite everything going on around her. Primarily, it's her sort of coming to grips with her family life and deciding what's important to her, and in trying to reflect on the past in the sense of trying to reflect on people who are close to her and what they mean to her, and whether or not she's actually important to them is her major insecurity there, because she's fairly alone as a character, spending a lot of time by herself with the television and so on and so forth, and very, very much worried that of course that she's not really important to her father, and so she sort of goes through this sort of phase of her character arc where she's really worried that he's just not really she has difficulty in understanding that he really cares for her. Like, she knows that at a certain level, but doesn't really necessarily fully believe it. And her arc is by going through sort of all of the different things that he's gone through and that she's gone through, and discussing a lot about her mother in particular, and trying to figure out sort of what exactly she must mean to her father. It's not even her understanding what she feels for him. It's her coming to the understanding of what she means to him, if that makes any sense there. It's surprisingly, considering how important she is both to the plot and I think thematically to that particular game, a fairly simplistic and non-representative social link. But I still think it was a pretty interesting one just in its own sort of right there. In Persona 5, the Justice Arcana is actually represented by Goro Akechi. Now, we have to realize one important thing here. The Shin Megami Tensei series is almost always at its sort of root, or its historical root, about law versus chaos. That's actually the underlying morality behind the series. It's not good versus evil. It's about control versus freedom and that sort of thing. In Persona 5, you represent freedom. You don't represent control like you do in Persona 4 or 3. And because of this, the Justice Arcana, which represents law and order, is an antagonist. And this is, again, why I said major spoilers ahead. But Akechi is one of the primary antagonists to the series against you. I would argue to a certain degree he's not necessarily your opposite. In a certain sense, he is. I actually think that he actually makes a better reflection of what Makoto could have ended up being like had she not been, had none of this ever happened, in that she has sort of a lot more similar problems to him. Although she takes certain elements that he breaks down over in relative stride, but they have a much stronger mirror, in my opinion, to one another, whereas the main character and the main antagonist thus far of the series, which is Shido, I think that he mirrors the protagonist a lot better. Like I said, I think Makoto's the deuteragonist of the series, but in any event, so Akechi's social link is actually revealed to you automatically. You don't have to advance it. But ironically enough, the thing that he is not capable of surmounting, getting past, is the protagonist and his group of friends. But at a more fundamental level, he's incapable of coming to grips with why he's alone, why he doesn't have the things that he necessarily wants, which is primarily friends, I'd argue. Friends and companions who trust him. And the reason that he's done this is debatably because he represents the Justice Arcana as taken by the Fool's Journey and failing. He's taken a look at his past, and he sort of understands the elements of his past. His mother having died early on, and his father being a very, very corrupted individual who's simply using him, and so on and so forth. But he doesn't necessarily learn from those lessons. He doesn't understand the important things about his decisions in the past, his murders, and so on and so forth, and why that makes him different. But he does sort of have a very strong sense of morality that leads him to sort of redeeming himself somewhat at the end, where I think he sort of realized a little bit about what perhaps was important, but it's difficult to say for sure because he, again, spoilers, dies very, very shortly after that. So I think that to a very large extent, Akechi actually represents the Justice Arcana in the journey as having failed to resolve itself effectively. I think, again, the Hanged Man Arcana in this particular case could represent the protagonist, which was someone that he couldn't end up beating, but I think it could also represent his loneliness and the fact that he could not accept that part of it. I could not accept the fact that he couldn't control that, because he describes in quite vivid detail how he tried to become the perfect person, someone who would be relatable, popular, intelligent, well-spoken, well-groomed, and so on and so forth, and tried to control every element of his life just so that he could be, well, popular, essentially. but that didn't work out for him. He didn't actually have any close friends. He had plenty of admirers, but they were transient. They were people who were willing to turn on him if that desire to do so happened to exist in them, if things turned around. Whereas, obviously with the Phantom Thieves, they're a very close-knit group of actual friends. Even if things turn around, they're all there for one another. So that was something that he was intensely jealous of. I think that to a certain extent, though, like it is a very, very different interpretation of the Justice Arcana than we'd seen in previous games. But again, that's because it's an antagonizing force in this game. It's the opposite of the ideas that are represented in Persona 5. That safety versus security question, he would represent security and law and order and so on and so forth, rather than the concept of freedom. That is the core of the Phantom Thieves and of what everyone else is doing. And despite that, he's just as shackled down as everyone else. So yeah, that's sort of a look at a couple of the different arcanas from each of the games. Now, let me just describe why I think that Persona 4 does, generally speaking, the best job of the social links from just a psychological perspective. Whenever you're talking to people in Persona 4, because of the fundamental nature of what the core arcana is, the idea of truth, and the main theme of the game, self-discovery and of truth again, we end up with a situation where you end up with something very akin to a Jungian psychology session, where you're going through people's pasts and you're discussing their family, their relationships with others, what they think, what they believe, how they got to that place, and then helping them resolve that to decide their future. Whereas in Persona 5, what we have is people who are hung up on something that they're incapable of moving past. And for many of them, this is solved through supernatural means. For example, Takemi, you couldn't actually get past without changing something in someone else. And this is very, very common in many of the other social links that I've gone through so far. These are people who can't really help themselves, and who other people can't help without using supernatural powers. And so we end up with situations where, the resolution isn't so much therapeutic like it was in Persona 4, because in Persona 4 it is very much a process of therapy, of almost a sort of Jungian style, where it's about introspection and talking about the past life of the individual and the experiences. Well, it's actually kind of Freudian in that sense as well, but in Persona 5, it really just does come down to you manage to solve the problem of the thing that's shackling them down by removing that shackle in an immaterial way, which I don't think works quite as well in sort of reference to this Jungian psychology sort of idea there, or the idea that the main character sort of is there to provide therapy for these characters. I've found it so far in Hifumi Togo's social link, in Oya Shindo's, in Kawakami's, in Takemi's. It's in quite a lot of them. I can't remember all of them, and I haven't completed all of them. But there's so many characters where that's the case, where you do that. And I don't think it works quite as well on a psychological level, just because you're no longer really doing that sort of thing. But I think that might just be a lightning in a bottle combination there, where the idea about truth really does work well for the idea, and that arcana mixes really well with the idea. So, that's just sort of one of the differences between the games, and I can't really fault it. It's just where, the ideas of a theme sort of intersect with all these other elements to make it sort of really strong in one area. I think Persona 5 works better in other areas compared to 4, but I think that the social link mechanic and the way that they're resolved in 4 is actually a bit stronger than it is in 5, just because of that sort of element of being able to solve it purely through a therapeutic process, because that works, I think, in my opinion, really well with the idea of Jungian psychology. In any event, let's talk a little bit about where I've gotten into in the game here. So I've just beaten Shido's dungeon, and it was too long. It took me something like 6 hours to beat the dungeon in total, and it took me something like 3 hours to beat the boss. And I mean, actually, I think I was fighting him across 4 attempts for 3 hours, and a couple of them I died really, really quickly in. I am playing on the hardest difficulty, so it is not necessarily too surprising about that. Now, as one of the interesting things was that I was actually thinking that you probably end up offing Akechi on your own at some point, or you might be offered to off Akechi at some point. as I mentioned earlier, he does die actually in this chapter, but he actually sort of kills himself rather than you doing anything to him. He's sort of at the end of his rope there and realizes that you have everything that he'll never have. And after coming to realize that, he requests that you change Shido's heart for him, and then promptly dies. So it was an interesting end to that particular character. He was pretty much antagonistic to you, however, right to the very end in a very strong sense there, in a very real sense. But had decided that there were other problems that if he couldn't fix them, it would be better if you did instead. I was right, though, in the sense that he did actually intend to off Shido had things gone his way, but of course Shido was also planning to off him. They were planning to double-cross each other, but yeah, that's sort of the case there. The ending for the dungeon as well, the boss itself, was interesting in the sense that it really did sort of demonstrate to me that I think that Shido actually does believe in a lot of his own rhetoric, in that what he's doing is, again, the best thing possible for Japan. The weird thing is that, like, there's certain elements to what he's doing that betray that as an obvious lie, and I think that part of his subconscious must realize that, but the shadow is the subconscious, essentially. So it doesn't seem as though his subconscious self was really cognizant of the contradictions of what he was saying. It's probably just that sense of him classifying certain people as being the other, which is a common technique in both politics and war and so on and so forth, where you fail to realize that your opponents are people. In his particular case, I think he doesn't view the poorest people of Japan and the people who are powerless as people. I think he only views the strong as being people. And anyone else is just the other. They're not significant enough to even consider. So when he's talking about the future of Japan, he's talking about the future of Japan only for the rich and powerful, where he'll make them even more rich and powerful. And anyone that doesn't fall into that particular category isn't worth his time. I think he legitimately believed that down to his core, though, up until you changed his heart, which is something that you, again, do manage to do there. There isn't a whole lot to say there as far as that goes. He was an interesting boss in a certain sense there, but his motivations, I felt, were just so disconnected from elements of the main character that it felt personal in the vindicative, in the sense that you get to vindicate yourself for the fact that he's also the person that accused you of a crime very early on in the game. He's the reason that you're in the whole situation to begin with. But at the same time, while he's guilty of pretty much everything, he feels almost a little bit too much like a cardboard cutout villain, even in a game that is just absolutely filled with cardboard cutout villains. Yeah, I was hoping that they'd sort of go more into him, though, and his motivations and why he was doing what he was doing. There's still potentially time for that, but I found that for, like, Kaneshiro and Madarame, and not really the first one, actually, but for a lot of the people that you encounter, you get a deeper insight into their motives and why they were doing those things. Like Sai Nijiwa, you get a fairly deep insight into why she believes the things she believes, and for a lot of the other characters as well. Even if it's just a brief glance, it can tell you an awful lot about what they're doing. In his particular case, I didn't really get any idea as to why he's doing what he's doing, or what's informed his belief about why he's the only person who can steer Japan in the right direction. I got really no indication as to why he believes that. I mean, there's some indication in the sense that he seems to believe that he's, like, chosen by God or something like that, but that's the sort of delusion that's usually justification for a belief that you've already got, rather than the delusion in and of itself. Like, I'm not entirely sure if that is just the only reason for his belief behind that. Now, this could actually indicate the sort of same thing that we saw in Persona 4. The final instigator of Persona 4 wasn't actually any individual person. It's actually a goddess. Same with Persona 3. So this might be indicating the same sort of idea, that there's some sort of higher power at play behind him that was inspiring him to do these things, and it would not surprise me at all if that winds up being the case. Some sort of agent of, I guess in this particular case, law, perhaps, that's enticing him to do that. So we'll see if that ends up being how that shakes down. Not really necessarily sure what it would be, because this doesn't really follow a standard sort of mythology pattern like the other ones did. Like, you could kind of guess in Persona 3 that it might be someone like Nyx, because it's a god of death. Could have been someone like Hades, for all I knew. or something like that. In Persona 4, just because you start off with Izanagi no Okami, Izanami no Okami becomes a little bit more obvious, because that's kind of, they're kind of classically people that go together in that sort of sense there. I think that in Persona 5 it's going to be a lot harder to guess. Like, I think the rival for Arsene Lupin, I don't know who that actually would be in terms of like some sort of deity. I don't think there is a deity that particularly has it out for Arsene Lupin. But in any event, like, we'll have to see how that sort of goes. But yeah, I mean, it was actually a fairly interesting dungeon in terms of game design, but again, it was far too long. One of my favorite parts of it, though, was like the really awful Yusuke puns. Every time you got turned into a mouse, basically, for the first few times, Yusuke would give these really, really crappy puns directed straight at Futaba, and she would just like deadpan him. She wouldn't even like dignify his really crappy puns with a response. It was great. It was a great dynamic there. So yeah, that kind of is how that sort of shook down. One of the things that I was both really happy with and somewhat disappointed with was their calling card for Shido. I was really hoping that it was going to be a video, and they delivered on that. Like, I was actually thinking that was probably going to be something that you got your reporter buddy to do, rather than having Futaba simply hacking into everything and having the announcement be through that. I thought you'd go through your news reporter buddy, but I kind of did think that those big TV screens that were all over Shibuya were going to play an instrumental part in you putting out a calling card, because like you just had to at some point in time. I was hoping that it was going to just be like the main character sitting in this big chair or something like that, in the classical sort of like evil villain sort of pose, staring down the camera kind of thing. But so like the aesthetic of the message itself, I didn't think was actually that strong. I thought it could have been a little bit more stylish. But I think that comes down to Futaba and her directing capabilities more than anything. But yeah, it could have looked better, is all I'm saying there. Could have had more red. But yeah, I was not disappointed by the fact that it was just this big flashy display on all these TVs and so on and so forth. I thought that part was great. So yeah, we'll have to see how this game goes. What I'll understand if it's truly the Hanged Man that underlies the entire game here, if there's some point where I can't do something, and where the game tells me that I have to give up. If that happens, then I'll know for sure that it was the Hanged Man, but I'm not entirely sure until that point there. But it's been such a recurrent theme in all of the social links that, like, the other problem is going to be understanding when that is, because it wasn't during the interrogation. Mind you, I hadn't completed enough social links by the end of the interrogation to actually know for sure whether or not there was any Arcana. Like, I wasn't sure until fairly recently, because when I started completing, I started completing all of them basically at the same time. So I kind of got inundated with all of these people who have these insurmountable problems that you suddenly fix when they give up. And so, like, yeah, it kind of hammered at me all at the same time there. But I'm not necessarily sure if that's the full direction that the game is going. But we'll have to see as I continue forward. Maybe if I get a choice of giving up at some point, I'll try taking it. I'll obviously have a save file like right before then, and if it turns out that I'm wrong, then I can redo that. But I get the feeling like that's probably going to be the case. So that's going to be our video for today. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.